All for coming in and taking a seat for our executive roundtable. I'm Judith Corley-Lay with the National Center for Pavement Preservation, and I get to moderate this event. Just a little truth in advertising. I did send these gentlemen the questions last week, or maybe even a week before, so that they could think about it. But I randomly picked who would answer each of the questions. So not scripted, but at least not completely off guard. I'm going to start by doing the introductions for all four of our executives. On my far right, George Connor has been Deputy Director of Operations at Alabama DOT since December 2016. Paul Degges is next to my right. He is the Deputy Commissioner and Chief Engineer of Tennessee DOT. Paul Looney is Deputy Secretary in the Kentucky Transportation Cabinet. Last but not least, James Williams is the Deputy Executive Director and Chief Engineer with Mississippi DOT. Please welcome our four executive speakers. All right, the first question that I ask them is to let each of them to briefly describe their state's pavement preservation program.
So my name's George Connor with Alabama DOT, and I'm very pleased to be on the panel. So, short description of the pavement preservation program at Alabama DOT. We have a pavement preservation policy that defines the operating rules, if you will, for our pavement preservation program for everything that is at a minor rehab level or under. We categorize that into three categories: PM1, preventative maintenance 1, light work, PM2, middle work, and minor rehab, which includes then milling down into a binder layer. There are all sorts of variations and implications and mazes you go through applying and administering that policy. That policy then is used in the administration of resurfacing program this past fiscal year, which for Alabama will end, we're in about the middle of, our current fiscal year, which will end this coming September 30th, at about $260 million set aside for non-interstate resurfacing. Of that $260 million, it's distributed amongst our 10 areas by a formula that is proportional to the number of lane miles of asphalt pavement, hot mix pavement that they have within each area relative to the statewide total. Each of the areas develops a program, identifies their projects, submits those, and we build our statewide program, and then they're held accountable through the year is, do they deliver that program? One of the tools that we've recently implemented is that if you don't have your program under contract, or at least let and bids received by a specified date, then any monies that you have left in your program for that year are forfeited and are available for redistribution to the other areas that have projects ready. Prior to implementing that, we did that last year. Prior to implementing that, we would have a rash of projects that were due or tried to get in August and September, right before the end of the fiscal year, which also coincides with the end of any reasonable resurfacing period of the year as well. Since we did that, last year the cutoff was July. This year it was June. Next year I've already put the regions on notice that it will be May. And since we've done that, it took a couple of years, but we are very compliant. We are getting our program let early. When we're looking at end-of-year rescission issues or not getting as much back from redistribution, our resurfacing program is pretty much safe because it's already under contract. So afterwards, I'd be glad to explain anything and answer questions. And if not, Mark waits. Mark, are you in here? You'll know Mark if you don't know him already. Ask him any and everything, I beg you.
All right, thanks. Again, I'm Paul Degges. I'm the Chief Engineer for the Tennessee Department of Transportation. Mark Woods is our pavement engineer. He's here with me this week. So I want to kind of take a little bit of a different slant and not quite get down in the weeds, but talk to you a little bit about how our program is, what we're trying to do. We want to make sure that we are meeting our customers' needs. Our customers tell us, we've done statistically valid surveys and all that kind of stuff, and in the South, it's probably similar, but our Tennesseans tell us that smooth roads and good bridges are what they're looking for. And so for us, we want to be able to make sure that we've got a program that is looking at our assets, trying to look at their conditions, and make sure that we are making the right investments to keep those things in the highest possible condition for the longest possible time. That is a difficult equation sometimes. We want to make sure that we are putting the right number of resources toward it. Back in the early 1980s, well, mid to late 80s, our General Assembly came to the department and said, "Tennessee, your roads suck. What's it going to take to fix them up?" And the experts back in those days said, you know, it takes real dollars. And so they passed a piece of legislation that had a big list of projects, but it also said, based on TDOT staff input, that we needed to have a roughly 12-year resurfacing cycle. Back in the 1980s, we weren't real sophisticated, and that was the best kind of idea we had. So that gave the department legislative intent behind looking at our pavements and coming up with a high-quality network. So over the years, back in those days, it was hot mix. In fact, it seems like there was a lot of jobs back in those days that we would get a supplemental agreement to add a binder layer to it. So we were building some good roads, but we were blowing through cash. When the 2000s started hitting, we could not go through, we just didn't have the money, and so we've kind of looked at thin mixes, mill and fill type projects, and we started looking at how can we take an asset management approach. I'll give Larry Galehouse a shout out. I had him come down to Tennessee in 2005 or 6 or something like that, and we started trying to look at this from a not just forced on us preservation approach, but trying to look at it, how can we look at the right treatment on the right road at the right time. We have peaks and valleys still. We get people that we have advocates, we have champions. We've got a champion that back here, and he's an example. He retired on me. And so one of the things we have to do, you have to do continual improvement. Meetings like this are important, but to get that information out there, what are the various tools available, and have an industry that we can work with that comes in and works with us to where we can kind of showcase what we do. A lot of the non-structural types of things we do, while we're putting that down, we get a few complaints from our legislators. I can go sit down with them and show them what we're trying to do, and it makes sense. Last year, we entered legislation into our work program through our General Assembly to grow the fuel tax in Tennessee. Had we not shown the people of Tennessee that we were using all the tools available to us to maintain pavements and bridges at a high quality at a low cost, I don't believe the people of Tennessee would have gone along with that recommendation to raise the fuel taxes. My view internally for our program is to bring the right experts in and look at all the different tools available to us and make sure that we're trying to stay not necessarily on the cutting edge and using, exotic materials, but using stuff that is proven, that is research-based, that allows us to have a strong program that our customers can see the value in.
Thanks, Judy. I'm Paul Looney. I'm the Deputy Secretary with the Transportation Cabinet in Kentucky. I'm glad to be with you all here today. I served with Judy for several years on the Joint Technical Committee of Pavement, so I grew up as a pavement engineer. And when I moved out of pavement engineering upstairs, the first committee meeting I went to, they all expressed shock that they let a pavement guy out of pavements, out of the technical stuff, up into executive management. But they did, and maybe I've been promoted to my level of incompetence, although I think I may have a few steps left to go. We have our pavement preservation in Kentucky has evolved significantly over the course of the last 10 to 15 years. I'll say it was deliberate, but our folks in the room would probably use some other words like slow. But thanks really to the perseverance of our champions, especially John Wilcoxon and Tracy Novacek here in the room, we have gained significant momentum over the course of the last couple of years. Especially. That deliberate approach and really looking at data and best practice has really allowed us, I think, put us in a really good position so that now that we do have support really at the Secretary's level and the Governor's office, it's put us in a really good place to look at a full suite of preservation treatments and really looking at how we can apply those in Kentucky. Our previous efforts really were largely conventional resurfacing, so inch and a half resurfacing. That's pretty much what we did. And when we didn't have enough money to fix everything, things just kind of fell off and our system continued to deteriorate. But we now really do have a program that does balance a lot more. We've invested significantly more of the dollars that we have available to preservation treatment. So now we've gone from a kind of a test bed to really a broad application across the state on all levels of facilities, essentially. Really, for us, I think the magic in that deliberacy over the course of the last 10 years has really been, we created, or our staff created, a Preventive Maintenance Alliance, which essentially brought in our district offices, so engineers across the state and the cabinet. We've now expanded that to local agencies and our industry partners. So I think our last meeting had a couple hundred probably at the Preventive Maintenance Alliance meeting, so in Kentucky. So we're really seeing a lot of folks getting engaged. So as we learn right treatment, right condition, right time type stuff, we've really, our staff is really focused on that effort. And the real magic, and we have quite a bit of folks here today from our district offices, has really been their engagement. So it's really been a lot more than just buy-in from them. It's really been, years ago the central office would kind of do stuff and kind of push it down and then it would happen. We're really much more organic now, where our districts are actually coming up with projects and research needs, and that's been a big shift for us when you actually have staff across the cabinet engaging in, hey, we should study this or we should research that. That's when you really know, I think you've kind of hit a magic level, when we're starting to see that kind of engagement from our staff and them really bringing things to us or to the staff in Frankfort in our central office. Because really at the end of the day, doing the right treatment at the right time, really a lot of these are very complex. So the complexity of implementation in the field of a lot of these treatments. It's the graph earlier about a lot of why things go wrong, and it's a lot about how it's put in, how it's placed in the field, and that's really what drives maybe a lot of the failures or the ultimate success of that. So we have really reached a critical mass in that regard too, with staff that we have across our maintenance, across our 12 districts, across the Commonwealth, that have gotten engaged in that.
James Williams, Mississippi DOT Chief Engineer. It's good to be on the Gulf Coast. Just a short history of myself. I spent probably 10 years growing up on the coast, and I don't make it down as much as I would like to, so it's good to be here today, even though I think it turned summertime today. Like, we had like 2 days of spring and now it's summer, so but we're glad you're here. When I talk about pavements, and we've if you remember back to Director McGrath's comment, she talked about in Mississippi that we are really dealing with some of the funding issues that our neighboring states are all fighting as well. Some have been successful, and we're close, but we're not there yet. And when you talk about asset management and the things that we try to do with probably our most significant asset, which would be our pavements, we've got to be able to tell that story. And the story I've been telling for about the last 2 years is that we are literally managing the decline of our pavements. So how does that relate to pavement preservation? Well, it relates because, we can't fix everything. Back in 2014, when I kind of moved out of materials, which really didn't have a whole lot to do with pavement management, we were just the material gurus, right? I started looking at pavement management data. And when you really look at that pavement management data and you start determining what your gaps are, how much money do we really need? Very large numbers come back at you. At the time in 2014, we were using the number $2.4 billion being our gap. So at a snapshot in time, if you went out and determined, based on your pavement management data, what needed to be done, whether it be preservation, some type of minor rehab, major rehab, to all of your lane miles, that number was around $2.4 billion. In 2 years, in 2016, it was up over $3 billion. So that truly tells you that we are managing the decline of our pavements. With all that said, we cannot fix everything. So what do you spend your money on? What do you invest your money on? And I think that's where it's really important that we really focus, and we try to do that, focus on things that are going to give us the best life cycle cost. So a lot of the treatments that kind of fall into that pavement preservation realm are things that we can do to our pavements at a fairly low cost that will extend the life and give those life-extending benefits that ultimately pay for themselves over and over, because we're avoiding the major rehab type projects that cost 4, 5, 6, 7 times as much. So we've really been focused on that over about the last 10 years. We started off fairly simple and just said, okay, arbitrarily 10% of our maintenance paving program is going to go toward preservation. It's gotten beyond that now, because as we speak, we're working on a new pavement management system, and that pavement management system has it built in there where we have decision trees based on the condition, traffic, these various factors that will basically tell you, this is the right treatment at the right time. And being able to utilize that to make effective decisions on what needs to be done to the pavement. So we're moving there, but I will say data is the key. And as we talk about national performance measures and asset management and how that all plays together, we're all telling our story. And the story is, we are, in Mississippi at least, managing the decline of our pavements. I think I'll leave it at that right now, but I appreciate the opportunity to be here.
All right, from now on, there'll be 2 people responding to each of my questions. The second question will be answered first by Paul Degges and then by Paul Looney, I guess the 2 Pauls. How does pavement preservation fit into your asset management program?
So I think I think they all go hand in hand together. So, when we look at performance measures and trying to look at data, kind of tell our story, I think it's important that the programs follow that. I know that the federal rules and all come out, talk about I'm going to call those performance indicators. That's not what I'm talking about here. That's something so Congress can measure us, I guess. But when we run our systems, we're looking at the data that is specific to our states. I suspect the southern states have similar issues. But if you look across the country, the decisions that you're using to figure out how to maintain your network is probably going to vary somewhat from state to state. I think that the asset management approach is critical to that, to look at how are you looking at your network. Do you need to stratify your interstates, your primaries, your secondary, and then your low volume? You don't treat a low volume rural road hugging a creek the same as you do a modern freeway. And so that classifying your assets, measuring them, I think that's critical. And then it goes back into how does that management classification and understanding how it's performing, how does it tie into the types of selections, the types of tools you're going to have on those things. So that's what we want to push out to our staff. We want people in all levels of the organization to be able to understand what we're trying to accomplish, and knowing what you have, I think, is important. So that asset management approach is a critical component.
Talking about funding, we just came out of a legislative session, our every other year budget session, and it was interesting, probably to say the least. Whenever you show up on CNN or other national networks, you know it's probably not a good thing. So we had a pretty significant push for more funding, and that was one of the things that did not make it through the legislative session. However, on the silver lining side of that, two of our real priorities that we pushed, one was we were going to focus on asset management. So we were going to focus on pavement and bridges. That was something that came from the governor's office. That was going to be was a priority for him. Is to say we got to take care of what we have, and we also implemented a data-driven quantitative project prioritization system. So for the first time ever, we used data to actually develop the capital side, and we focused on first. So off the top, we recognized we had 3,700 miles of our state primary system of pavements in poor condition. We had 1,000 bridges that were deficient, needed work. So we said, okay, what do we need to address those in a 10-year time frame? We carved that off the top. Then we took what was left and put it into a data-driven prioritization system, and showed what funding we had, what projects we would recommend. And the real success is that both of those basically came out of the legislature intact. So they added a few small projects here and there, but by and large, I think they took one of 400 bridges maybe out or in, and so our funding, that we got funding for asset management dedicated really for the first time ever, so that what now we can do is then look at actually doing optimization of a pavement system, the stuff that Tracy and her staff are really, really good at, and haven't had the opportunity in the past, because we would just call them up and say, hey, we got somebody now to do something. Every few months we would call them. Now we have some sustainable funding to really look at that. So when we look at asset management, we've also said PM is going to be a part of that. So we have committed funding specifically to that. When you look at what that looks like, so we were at about $125 million a year conventional resurfacing. That allowed us to address about 1,500 centerline miles a year of our roads. When we took that from 100 million conventional to 25 million of PM type treatments, we then increased what we could affect by 30% up to 2,000 miles. And that's the real, when you communicate to legislators or the public, that's the kind of data I think that they see, that you can really get to their road or fix, make something better near them sooner, because you're really increasing what you can affect. So at a high level, we about doubled our pavement funding available to us, which is significant at really allowing us to affect more. Dealing with the industries, there is a perception that, well, if you get enough money, then you don't need to do PM stuff anymore, right? And really the answer, and you all know that, is no. That's not really the right answer, because this, we have about $8 billion backlog of stuff we need to do with projects, and so there's a big gap, and getting the money, as we've seen, whether it's from the federal government or our local gas tax, is going to, that delta is so big that it's, I hate to say impossible or never, don't use absolutes, but it would be very difficult to get there in the near future. So I know all of you all, and I agree, and so does our secretary now, that being able to use these treatments to keep our good pavements and fair pavements in those conditions or better is absolutely critical as we move forward.
All right, the next question: what are the biggest challenges you face in maintaining a state of good repair? So this will be James and George.
This is a very easy question. Funding, right? Just a few facts to reiterate. As as has been said, you know, the gap is so large that we have really, as states, got to do the best we can do to make sure that we're doing the right thing at the right time. Political fallout from that is sometimes things get let go. And so, you know, we occasionally have the call or the question about, well, you know, why are you doing this over here when this road is in much worse condition? And we fight those things, but having that data and being able to show that we are doing the most cost-effective things is really, really important. And I will say that we, and I'm going to say engineers, I know we're not all engineers here, but as engineers, we don't always do a very good job communicating that. So one of the things with the asset management type philosophy that has really been a positive that has come out of that is that we finally kind of have the tools to be able to communicate that. Short answer is funding is the biggest challenge, but you know, we've got to have the right data. We've got to be able to show what the life extending benefit of the treatments that we're doing. We've got to be able to show that in a life cycle type analysis to show that that money is being invested wisely. And as we're able to better communicate that, I think that message gets easier and easier.
So what are the barriers in having a system that's in a state of good repair? My number one's the same as James. It's a lack of funding. And even states that have had recent success with increasing their revenue, needs exceed, you know, the ability to fund. And for states that have not, and Alabama's certainly in that mix, it's even more so. It is the fuel that runs the preservation engine, you know, and without it, you just can't accomplish the work. But I also have identified two other barriers. One of them is the condition of your network, where you start from, has a lot to do with your ability to keep your system in a state of good repair. So if you're in a state, as many of us have or are, where work was not done or deferred for so long, and you're starting with a network that's in a generally poor shape, the effort, the burdens, the barrier, the things you have to overcome to change your network to be in a general state of good repair is way different than if your overall network is just marginally better. And heaven help us if it was significantly better. How much easier would that be to keep it there? I mean, that's one of the fundamental tenets of preservation. It's easier to keep something good and cheaper than it is to bring it all the way back from where it's completely fallen apart. But if you're starting out with a network that is mostly fallen apart, that's just a bigger hill to climb. You have to climb it. You have to do this. You have to do the process. You have to start where you start, and you have to keep at it. But it just means that it'll take a lot longer before you'll reach that state that you're trying to reach of whatever you define as generally good repair. Third thing they've identified for Alabama in particular is a conversion, a culture conversion, and the practical processes that go along with that culture conversion from worst first to a pavement preservation program. I don't know that we've got anybody in the state of Alabama, that would stand up and say, I believe worst first is the right way to go, and that's the only way we should be treating this. Nobody would say it, but a lot of people do it. And there's a number of reasons. Well, I've got to treat this, or I've been pressured, whatever that case is. We all understand that. But how do you get from where we intellectually understand the advantages of implementing a preservation program, even if the initial benefits and payoff is slim and the effort is hard? How do we go from, you know, doing what's expedient or necessary to changing that? Well, it's a culture conversion. So that if my hands are tied, and 90% of the time, because of where I inherited my network condition, I still have to do worst first. I just have to. That's going to fall apart in a meaningful way, right? Well, what am I going to do with the other 10%? Am I going to pick the next worst one just because what difference is 10% going to make? Or am I going to apply that thought process and say I'm going to do what I can and move the needle a little bit? To that end, we've implemented a program of developing a process that has a foundation of data and has a defined process, a repeatable process, saying what our tools are and when they apply and how you apply them. And the challenge that we have that goes along with this culture, conversion of culture, is to get our areas and our regions to buy into that. Right now, out of our 5 regions, 10 areas, I would say we probably have a third who are all in. Some of them are ahead of the others. We have a third that are working at it, and we have a third that are giving it lip service. I mean, if you asked them, they're not giving it intentional lip service, but in practical sense they are. And that culture conversion is important. It's been said, not by me, and I forgot who said it, or I'd absolutely attribute it to the right person. But culture beats strategy every day. Others have said culture eats strategy for lunch. If you'll get people thinking the right way, then even if they're not doing it the best way, they're going to make the right decision and move in the right direction and do the things that are needed, because culture, if it's inculcated, if it's deep inside somebody, always comes out. Strategy can change, especially if I haven't bought it and digested it and made it my own. So 3 things: funding, starting condition, and then a conversion of culture.
How are you balancing the needs of bridges and pavements with other performance goals? And I do want to just remind you of Luis's slide this morning that showed that we have performance measures in areas of safety and congestion and system operations, and there are a total of 7 different performance goals. And of those, bridges and pavements are just that infrastructure condition piece. So, and this goes to Paul Degges and George Connor.
This one, and I have been fortunate to visit a few other countries across the world, and I've had this same question come up. In Japan, the asphalt industry is very strong. The bridge guys don't get nothing. And they were lamenting. I've been to a few other places in Europe and Asia and heard the same thing. And so I'll kind of give you kind of my approach. As engineering and technical people, we all want to throw data in a box, crank the handle 3 times, and it gives us a list on what we should do. But that's just not going to happen. Think about your children. I have a son. Now, he's 35 now, but he was really good at football, 5A sports, and I needed to nurture his athletic ability. My daughter, on the other hand, was really good at drama and art and stuff that I just don't understand a whole lot. And truth be told, I'm not very good at sports either, but I needed to be able to nurture both of my children and to be able to allow them to be successful. And I think that's what we have to look at. Sometimes you got to spend a little bit more time practicing lines with your daughter, and your son might be pretty good at out there on the football field. But on the other hand, my daughter was pretty good about her studies and making good grades in classes, and I had to put a whole lot more time with my son and making sure he got through his academic work. So when you're looking at these different assets, you can't, I just don't believe that you can just throw all this data in a box and get the answer, because they're 2 fundamentally different things. And that's where it takes our intellect, our experience, and our knowledge about this profession to be able to look at stuff You know, I tell my staff that, you know, I don't want to have the smoothest pavements in the country and then hit a bunch of crappy bridges. We've got to be able to kind of balance those investments out there. And so we're trying, what I ask is for the three biggies: maintenance, bridge, and pavements. For Tennessee, pavements are our single largest asset class. Bridges are pretty big as well. And then routine maintenance stuff. And I asked staff to come give me a presentation annually telling me where we've been, where are we at, and what are we projecting, to try to make sure that we're balancing those investments. I will argue that in Tennessee, and it's probably true in a lot of southern states, is that congestion is just not as bad as an overall issue. That I have, there's rare cases where I'm having to balance congestion with asset condition. But one of these days I will get to the point to where I'm going to have to sacrifice dollars for asset condition to address a congestion level somewhere. I'm not there yet. I'm fortunate we just don't have the volumes. But I think that's one of the areas that we've got to be able to keep an eye on as well, to see how congestion impacts our ability to do business.
I think that's a very apt and excellent illustration about like the needs of your children each are different. My wife and I have 3 boys, and they're all, you'd know in a minute that they belong to Connor family, but they're all so very different, and dealing with them has been very different. However, no matter what the differences are, there are also things, even if it's not the same for each, there's things that overlap. And I think one of the challenges for Alabama, the way I see it, in balancing performance goals, is that we think of, I think of, and make this personal, I think of too often as those performance goals as individual and independent and totally alone of each other. So my bridge condition is in a world to itself. My pavement conditions are in a world to itself. My safety performance goals are unto themselves: congestion, system operation, etc. And I would submit to you that that's not true. And let me give you I think the clearest example is between preservation of bridges and pavements and safety. We are conditioned to think of those two things as very separate programs. And so when we often think of, when I work on one, it is at the expense of the other. And to some degree that's true, because it's not a one-to-one match of needs or solutions. But when we have pavements that aren't full of potholes, that don't have ruts that are full of water and you hydroplane when it rains, does that help safety? Absolutely. A preservation program has a safety component, but here's the challenge. How do you quantify that safety component, that safety contribution, in the ways that people who manage safety programs are used to thinking of it? I know in our state, it's a classic struggle, both at the state DOT level and within federal highway. If a dollar is not spent that has attached to it safety tag in some form or another, particularly an HSIP tag is what we call it, if it doesn't have that tag attached to it, it's not safety work. It's not considered safety work. It's not reported as safety work. It doesn't count as safety accomplishment or effort on behalf of Alabama DOT. We desperately need that way to link the two together in a quantifiable way that doesn't just make sense for one side or the other, but can talk to both sides. And by sides in this case, I am saying the asset preservation side versus our safety folks. They are not separate and they are not independent. They are not identical, but they are linked together. So if we think of the contributions that preservation makes, in this case with this audience particularly, good pavements with good frictional characteristics and that drain the right way and don't have something in it, that a hole or a dip that makes you lose control and run off the roadway. If we have all of those things, we have improved safety in a meaningful way. We just need our accounting, our bookkeeping, our linkages in a numeric way to catch up with that. And then I think we can demonstrate that we are balancing the two maybe to a better degree than what we already think we are. Second, I would say is how do you balance? Well, if your funding is tight, and Paul alluded to that, balancing is so difficult, right? There is a certain level of operating capital, so to speak, funds, that lets you make decisions between one or the other. But I remember those days when Chris and I were newly married couple, and we got down to the, you ran out of money before you ran out of month. We got down to the end of the month, and you couldn't balance your rent and car payment and utilities. One of them got picked up the next month, and the other one did this. You just had to make decisions. If you don't have funding adequate to do the minimum, balancing is very difficult. It's much more troublesome to accomplish and to do anything meaningful.
The next question, what do you need in order to sell preservation to legislators, industry leaders, and citizens? What questions do they always ask that you find difficult to answer? And this is for James and Paul.
For the MDOT folks in the room, y'all just close your ears for a minute because you've heard this. When we fail because we do not communicate. And I think one of the challenges with preservation kind of goes to that yin and yang of, we're spending money on roads that may be in fairly good condition. So from the eyes of the users, we're doing something on this good road while something else kind of falls apart. So how do we overcome that? Well, I've got a couple of things, and one would be kind of back to that life cycle cost. We've got to show the cost benefit, and I'm not sure we've really done that other than some generalities. I know we have not specifically done that for our Mississippi materials and how long treatments last and all of that. Now, there are efforts to characterize that, and I think we will get there, but right now that is a gap. We need to be able to show that cost benefit of what we're doing with preservation, because I think the eyes kind of glaze over with the legislators when you start putting things in generalities like, yeah, if we let it go, it's going to be 5 times more expensive. Well, where did that come from? Well, it comes from all this intuitive knowledge that we've gathered over the years to know that that's the case, but have we really put a number to it? The second thing I have is, we need to be able to communicate the life-extending benefit of these treatments. When you do a scrub seal, how long does it last? And the correct answer is not, it depends. Because that's really the answer, isn't it? It depends. It depends on the pre-existing condition. It depends on the materials. It depends on whether it's put down in a quality way. All of these different things. So what is the life-extending benefit? And we need to be able to communicate that in an effective way. And lastly, this kind of wraps up these comments, but we need to really preach the fact that we need to keep good roads good, and it costs less money. And so that's a very simple theme, but when you're managing the decline of your pavements, it kind of goes back to something that George said. It kind of depends on where you're starting from. And I will say in Mississippi, it's different if you're on the interstate system. We've got a substantial 4-lane system now in Mississippi. It's different on the 4-lane system. And heaven forbid you get on a 2-lane highway, because it's different yet again. we need to preach that keep the good roads good, because that's where our money is best spent. And we just have to fight with some of these other points about that really add to that discussion to drive home the fact that, look, yeah, this road's falling apart. We're going to have to deal with that in a few years, but right now it's just going to be bad, because that's the most cost-effective thing to do.
So yeah, I totally agree with James. Communication. To me, a lot of the answer to this question lies in the question itself, and it says, how do you sell it to legislators and industry and citizens? Because that message and that communication looks entirely different to those groups, in my opinion. We're real good with data as engineers. We're good at spreadsheets and pivot tables and bar charts and pie graphs. And what we're not good at is communicating to groups outside that are non-engineers. So we've in the last couple of years at the cabinet, we have been investing in project manager training, because we had found that we were not being very successful at meeting budget, scope, and schedule to deliver highway projects. And one of the things that we really focused in on a lot is that what we would find is that we spend a lot of time going to the public meetings, sharing what we're going to do for this project and how we're going to make it better. And we would talk about super elevation rates and degrees of curvature and things, and people's eyes would glaze over, and they'd leave the meeting, and oftentimes would say, you have a terrible, terrible idea. And so we started experimenting with actually getting people who are professional communicators, public relations firms, going out, and we would take the same solution with a different message out, and the people would say, man, that is brilliant, just a brilliant idea. To me, it's really, we have to recognize that how we take that data and tailor it to the different audiences that we're going out to. You know, from a legislative standpoint, for instance, I mentioned, you know, if we had more money, would we just do the same stuff? And the answer would be no. We would still want to do PM treatments, even if we had more money. But the selling point to them could be, well, hey, I've got instead of 100, let's say I have 200 million. Well, I still think we should do 170 million or 150 of conventional, or 170 million total program with PM, because what it would end up doing is I would free up capital money to go to capital projects. So I can affect more of the system, affect other stuff, whether it's bridges or whether it's congestion mitigation, you know, adding lanes to projects. So it's selling to the legislators at how I can do more of the stuff they want to do, which is not take care of the pavement. I mean, they want to have smooth roads, but we don't cut many ribbons on PM or pavement rehab projects. Maybe we should. Maybe that's something we should start. But we generally don't cut ribbons on those. So the things that they like are the bypasses and your economic development type projects. When you look at industry leaders, or the industry for us, and that was a big challenge. That's the right term, Tracy, I guess. You know, obviously, it was real chicken and egg for them, because we were dabbling our toe in it, and it was something totally new. And so from their perspective, and I'll be a little optimistic, it was commitment. It was really, you know, are we really committed to this? Are we really going to have consistent funding to do something for them to invest, whether it's a little bit for brooms and stuff, or a lot if you're doing a micro type treatment, you know? So what was the commitment from our end? From the public, and, you know, it's, you know, why are you doing this to my road? Or, you know, now we're actually this spring, in advance of going out this construction season, going to be doing a lot more work with a PR firm, but go out to look at, you know, how we can communicate to people what to expect. So we do things that we put initial treatment down and wait a couple weeks and come back with the final surface, right? And so it looks different in that interim. And John and his staff would get lots of calls. Man, what, you guys lost your minds. What are you doing out here? Well, just give us a little bit of time. We're not quite finished yet. So it's communicating, you know, expectations, so people know what to expect with their roadway. And then, as James and others have said, you know, why are you taking care of the good road when the bad road, it's over here? You're missing the boat transportation. But it's really trying to communicate that broader perspective of system level performance. And, you know, even for legislators, when you can show that whole thing gets better if you do it this way and really prove it to them, that message, at least on our end, has been largely accepted.
All right, we're down to my very last question, and that was for any of these gentlemen to talk about the biggest success they've seen from their pavement preservation program.
Well, I'll throw one out. When we started really looking at pavement preservation, a couple of things were happening to us at the time. We were seeing what I think the experts call a correction in petroleum prices or something like that. Basically, petroleum products were getting really expensive. And, you know, when I was getting some single bids and I was kind of carping about pricing, he said, well, if you don't like that price, I'll just go to North Carolina and Virginia and do some pavement. He wasn't very sympathetic. And so one of the opportunities that having a portfolio tools, and I know my road builders, every time I say a tool in the toolbox, I have to take a drink, you know, a thing. And, you know, but where I was going here is that by having these additional tools, we can address issues in the industry. And while sometime the industry were kind of saying, well, you're just penalizing me, you're using the wrong product. And I said, no. I said, I'm trying to manage the transportation network as well as I can. So the great thing that then happened, a lot of our industry came back to us and said, you know, we see some of the issues, and they brought innovation. And in Tennessee, we are now mainstreaming, if you will, some thin mixed asphalt products out there. We're able to compete different types of products out there. Frankly, it makes a lot of people a little bit mad at us. But I think most people realize that that's an opportunity. So one of the things that I think that looking at pavement preservation has allowed us to do is a lot of these companies in this room here today have used some of this innovation out there to allow us to have a better program, that we can get more life. When the resurfacing program people come to me and said, hey, Paul, we need more money in the program. Our models are showing this over the next 10 years. You know, I'm sympathetic and need to put more money in, but I'm also counting on innovation in our industry, research-based, new ideas that we haven't even thought of yet. And I think that's one of the biggest successes that we have out here, is that collectively working together, we can see what our peer states are doing, what other industries are doing, sometimes, you know, somewhere else in the world, bringing this new technology home to us to allow us to get that better product, a longer life at a lower cost. And I think that is one of the real successes that we've seen in preservation, both in pavements and frankly in the bridge program as well. I think safety is another big opportunity for us. There's a lot of the products that we're putting out there right now that sometimes there's a road out there that its real issue is skid resistance. A lot of these products, you don't have to do a structural repair, and you can come in and solve those problems. So I think that's some of the real wins that we're seeing that benefits the customers that we have out there.
I had said this earlier, but I think what our biggest success has been is our Preventive Maintenance Alliance for us. It's really our in-depth engagement and involvement across our cabinet, and many of those folks are represented here today, as I said. So our staff out in the districts that have really dove in deep off the high dive with Tracy and John, and have really embraced this and have really brought questions, and are really the frontline folks that are having to implement it. So they're having to answer the questions to the citizens when we're putting something different down, but they also understand the challenges and the risks to that. So from our perspective, that really has been the biggest success for us. Obviously, we had challenges over the last 10 or 15 years at really trying to gain significant momentum. You know, when you're trying to do anything new, you like trial and error, and like to learn from that. The error part was something that was very scary for us because of the spotlight that was put on what we were doing. So, you know, we're at a point now where I think it's okay if we push the envelope and understand what we've done and dial it back a little bit. I think we have significant momentum now to say, hey, we're trying to do as much as we can with the limited dollars that we have available to make our entire system better. So I think maybe I'm a little optimistic. I'm a lot optimistic. Tracy's smiling at me. That I think that we have an opportunity now, because we have, you know, we've seen now that we've have some of our local contractors that have, you know, they've bought in. They've bought micro equipment and other stuff, so they've made significant capital investments. So I think we're starting to see momentum on that side, really recognizing that we've committed as an agency to do this for our system.
So I'll be very brief, but one of the things that really excites me about where we are with our preservation type products is the fact that we're kind of thinking outside of the box now, and there really appears to be some synergy behind kind of combination of some different treatments. And Buzz Powell, I don't know if Buzz has this in his presentation, but I've heard him say it over and over and over about the synergy of some of these things. You know, you treat the symptom, but you do it in a couple of different ways. And we're doing more and more of that with our preservation dollars, where we may come in and do either crack sealing or a scrub seal to treat a symptom, but then we may do a thin lift on top of that. So it's a very cost-effective treatment, and we're seeing really good results out of it. I mean, especially on some of our 2-lane routes that I told you about that are probably a little bit far down the curve for preservation, but we're doing it anyway, and we're getting really good results. So that's something that I'm really excited about. We're kind of thinking outside of the box and not just putting a given treatment kind of in its silo and just leaving it there. We're kind of pulling those things out and trying some different things. So
I have 2 examples of success, and I think one of the things that's important is that if you want to build a program and continue with it, you need to look for success and you need to find it. And sometimes those successes are small, and sometimes they may not be as frequent as you like. But when they're there, you need to find them. You need to identify them. You need to claim them. And that is your success because of something you did. The needle moved. It might have moved a tiny bit, but it moved when it wasn't going to move before, or maybe go backwards. So success is important. But I have 2 specific examples. One's in the area of communication. James's statements about communication is exactly right. We suck at talking to people who are not like us, right? We do not, often fail miserably at communicating well with non-transportation people. If you're outside our agency or our industry, we don't do well. We have to do better. We must do better. Legislatures are a particularly hard group to talk to because they see the world in a certain way, and it's often not compatible with the way we see the world. We just happen to live in the same world, so we have to coexist. And that's a big, big, big challenge, even bigger than the general public out there, but it's a challenge that you have to undertake, and you have to learn to say things in a way that are meaningful to the other person, but communicate the message that you're trying to communicate. Here's one example. We've got an industry, just like was mentioned in all the other states, that may or not happy with some of the decisions that we've made and directions we've taken. And the executive head of the Road Builder Association came and he said, he asked me in an open meeting with the liaison group, he goes, why are y'all doing so many of these, lesser treatments, right? And I said, well, again, knowing some of the audience there, I said, it's like your car, right? You put your car in the shop, might need transmission, might need new tires, might need an alternator, you might just need an oil change. But you put your car in the shop for what it needs at that time. And if you say, because it's not a transmission, it's only an oil change, I'm not going to do that because I'm going to save my money for when it needs a transmission repair, then everybody gets it intuitively that that car is not long for this world. Now, he told me later, he said, you know what? That makes sense. He said, I'd rather you do more of what we've always done, but I understand it, and I've actually shared that with some other folks, okay? So communication's important, finding a way to communicate that message and then sticking with it. The second thing, I want to give some credit to one of our audience members. Mark Waits is our Assistant Maintenance Bureau Chief for our roadways and roadsides, and he's responsible for the management, if you will, of the program, once it's set, of our resurfacing and interstate maintenance. And I am, 2 years ago, and these numbers are approximate, Mark could tell you down to the nickel. 2 years ago, our average lane mile cost was just south of $500,000 per lane mile on the interstate for IM work. And that was all types of projects and across the state, all the different things that we did. This year, we're on track to be just under $300,000 per lane mile. And it's not because we cut corners, but it's because Mark and a bunch of other people that are doing the same thing Mark's doing were focused on doing the right thing at the right time. So if we did a bunch of PM1s and did them earlier and did the hard job of selling it and getting it through and the plan developed and funded in there, we move the needle. What does that mean in practical terms? If a politician asks me, why is that a big deal? You did lesser things. Well, you know what I did? Not I did. You know what Mark helped us do? We touched 68% more pavement for the same dollars this year than we did 2 years ago. That's meaningful. And so look for those kinds of successes. That's the kind of stuff that one of the big points that legislatures always want to be able to say is they're looking for inefficiency, and they like to claim success stories of the agencies that they're involved with, that they somehow affected a change. Well, whether they affected it or not, we just let them claim credit if that's what's helpful to us. But those are the kinds of numbers that you can put in front of them and say, do you know that for the same money, we're actually covering 68% more pavement now than we were 2 years ago? And Representative Smith, it's all due to your insightful and brilliant leadership. Say what you got to say, right, to get your message out there.
I'd like to thank these fellows all have plenty of work to do back in their offices, and they have given, I think, very generously of their time and their ideas. Thank you all very much. I appreciate it.
The preceding was produced by the National Center for Pavement Preservation. More information can be found on the web at pavementpreservation.org. Additional support provided by Michigan State University.